Welcome to section 5, part 2. In this section, we're going to look at implementing our selection for entities. And we've just got a few considerations that we want to think about before we just dive straight into this. The first one is entity grouping. So what I mean by that is how you are going to, so in an RTS, obviously drag a box and select a group of units. How is that going to be handled? Is it going to be fixed groups? Are they going to be semi-fixed? So you can perhaps select half a group, or is it just going to be fully flexible? Whatever you select is selected, and then they move as a group, whatever that is. And by fixed groups, I mean that you select a group, it's that group all the time. They don't really change. Members of the group don't change. And then that sort of on flows to the next one with navigation. So when you've got that group, are you able to move those individual entities in that group? Or are they going to move as group only, or are you going to be able to move like a setup I've had before is you can move half the group. So like, military sense, I was treating it as like fire teams in the group. So subgroups, I guess, would be the best way to look at partial group. So that's going to affect how you handle navigation and pass that down to the selection. And then the last one is the AI setup. So normal AI would be have an AI controller on the entity, and they handle all their behavior tree or state machine or whatever it is that you're controlling your entities with. The other option is to have part of that on the group. So you have some sort of calculation going on in a group sense. And this is where you can easily make members of a group communicate and know each other's information. So you'd still have the AI control on the entity, but there'll be some form of AI interaction with the group. And then the other one is group only. So this is where you sort of got maybe multiple visual characters, but they all just act as a single group. So they might only just have an AI on a group sense. For myself, I'm looking at probably leaning towards more fixed groups and maybe semi-fixed in the form of pressing Control 2 and you can group a bunch of stuff together to select it. Navigation is going to be probably group for me. I'm going to have the priority for me would be to move as groups, not individual, but I do want to have the ability to move individual units. It's going to be a crossover there for me as well. And then AI setup, mine's definitely group and entity. I'll be doing the AI, and I'm going to have some sort of state machine on the group to track the group behavior and like combat modes and whatever else. But I just wanted to bring those up as something to consider before you crack into this. I'm going to try and make things so you can cover them all, but I think in the end it's going to be optimized to what I was looking at doing, but I'm happy to help anyone who wants to change it up a bit. Probably the main one is that I'm going to have, with the fixed groups, I'm going to have an actor that is the group. Whereas if you're having sort of more like a flexible group setup, you probably want to just have instead of having an actor, the group would probably just be a struct you can create on the fly when you select it. The reason why I'm having an actor is because I want to have like a group icon and other information, and probably down the track with the AI stuff, I want to have actual state machine on there and other things that I don't want to just create on the fly. So that done, let's crack into setting up our selection. So I think the best starting point will be is to get our data sorted. Come into that's core, sorry. Probably going to have to create in entities. I'm going to close these other ones. So in entities, we want to create a data. So let's create a directory here. Call it, sorry, under framework. Data. In here, we're going to add a file, and it's just going to be our the first thing I'm going to do is create a struct for our selection. I'm going to call it RTS entities by our selection. We're definitely going to need a constructor for this. Like that. And our first variable, we're going to handle this by group. So I think we need to create the group actor class. I'm going to create that now. So under framework, I'm going to go class. I'm going to put that in the folder called entities under framework. Entities group. And I'm going to just open up the player controller here, which I might clean up these. I just copy in this initializer out of here and I'll close it. And we'll come back to this, but I just wanted the class reference for now. So go back to our data types, and the first one's going to be our group reference. So what group we're selecting, and I'm going to include, add the forward declaration for the group class. The other thing I'm going to have is I'm going to assign one of the units as the group leader, and we'll figure out how we're going to calculate that later. But at the moment, we just want a reference to an actor that is the lead. We're going to need a bool operator so we can check if one group is equal to another, one selection is equal to another. So I'm just going to add that. So that will allow us to say player selection equal to player selection, do some checks like that. Another one I know we're going to need is just is valid check. And close those. Now there'll be plenty more we need to add to this, but this will do for now. So we're just going to copy that struct name, come back to our group. Sorry, not back to our group. We need to go back to our player controller. And we need an array of our selections. Replicate this, and we'll use a function for that. Wait in a sec. So we're going to need some other variables here. So it's going to be a position, and it's going to be the, when we select to drag a box or whatever, this is going to be the start position. So I'm going to call it select start location, and I'm going to duplicate that one. We're going to have a select start screen location, and then another one, select start viewport location. So in our select function, which will be called at the point where we click the mouse, that's where we're going to set those variables. So first thing we'll do is we'll check we've got a world reference, and then we want to do some assignment to those variables. This will be our start location, and we're just going to initialize this as a 0 vector. So we can pass it to our get mouse position on terrain. And then we'll assign that to our world location. Then for the viewport, we're going to use the UWidget layout library. So that's going to include the widget layout library.h. And in there's a function to get the mouse position on the viewport. And we need to pass the world reference. All right, let's change. This is a 2D, and so is the viewport. And effector by default vector 3. Why that was red, yep. And then for the screen location, we're going to need some floats for our X and Y. Initialize those like that. And we're going to do get mouse position. So that's going to get the mouse X and Y coordinates on the screen. We'll just make vector 2D out of that. So that's those variables initialized. Now the other thing that can happen on press, we can actually just hit an individual. So this is if we want to select individual units, or even if we say we want to select, if we selected one unit in a group, selects the whole group, we still need to identify that. So what we're going to do here, because this will be coming from a client, we're going to create a new variable for that. And we're going to call it client hit selectable. Oops, sorry. And that'll just be to store the actor that we hit. We can initialize that in the constructor. Before I go on, before I forget, this just reminded me saying this, we actually need to create the function for the onRep. This that I'm talking about here. That's good. And then in here, we need to have a function that will assign that client hit selectable. So let's make that get hit selectable. I'm going to put that at the top there. The reason why I separated them, I usually put all my onReps at the bottom of the protected area. I might actually, because this is going to grow this player controller with some other stuff, I might actually make this section the selection. And then later I can do another one. So in this hit selectable, we just need to do a line trace to the terrain and then check if we hit a selectable. We're going to want a channel that all the selectable entities are on. So you could either make a custom query channel called selectable, or you could just make one for entities. But if you're going to have entities that aren't selectable or something weird like that, you might need to separate it out. But I'm just going to go to core for a second. I'm going to cheat again and copy stuff. And in our player controller here, we did some line tracing. So I'm going to go into here and I'm just going to steal all of this. Close that off. Into here. Oh, sorry, that was the wrong one. I actually wanted this. I'm going to use. Close that. I'm going to call this entities. And that was in our core static game data. I haven't created this channel yet, but don't let me forget. It will be channel 2, I'd say. Go and include that. So if we get a blocking hit here, that means, oh, sorry, I forgot to, returns an actor. Point of this was, yeah, so if we get a blocking hit here, we're going to return where we hit, or return the hit actor, right? We probably could do a check it's not null or something. And if we don't hit anything, we're just going to return a null pointer, so that'll set our client hit actor to null, and we can make this constant. So pending setting up that trace channel in the editor, that should be good. Now, one other thing we want to do is when we first click, if we're selecting other, so if we've got other groups selected, we want to just unselect whatever we've got selected. So we'll add the input modifier check here, so you can do things like hold control and select multiple units, but for now we'll just want to clear selections. And this being coming from the client, so this is going to execute on the client side. We're going to need to tell the server to clear selections as well, which will then do the onRep. I put that down here. So one other thing that's going to happen in here is this is where you'll handle, I'll put it in here. If you've got a bunch of entities selected and they're either highlighted in some way, like a decal underneath or some fancy other thing, you need to clear that client side. So this is where we'll send it. And I'm going to actually implement a component later on. So I'm just going to put a to do here because we'll come back to that. For now, let's just clear our selection. So our selections are greater than nothing. So we don't really want to cause an on-rep if we haven't changed the selections. So that's all that's doing. In C++, you have to manually call the on-rep on the server. So the purpose of the on-rep here is so you can notify whatever needs to know about selections changing. Like a very common one will be to update the UI. It's probably a good idea to have some sort of event we can call here that'll execute on the, well, execute everywhere, but the client can grab it and update the UI. So I'm going to go to the H and up here, I'm going to declare a multicast delegate. Sorry, one param. And we're going to pass a list of selected through that delegate. Come back to on-rep selected. Oh, sorry. I'm going to create the handle. There we go. Now there's another variable we're going to need, which I'm going to put down the bottom here. And it's going to be just a bool, so we can switch between a box selection and not. And I'll initialize that in the constructor. So I'm going to skip select hold for now. I'm going to cover that later. So select and is where we're going to use that bool. So I'm just going to check if that is a selection, if we're doing a selection box or we're just selecting something. We kind of need to set up the entity component at this point because we're going to start wanting to talk to it to make sure it's the entity component will hold who owns it. So we need to check that the person selecting it is the owner and they're allowed to select it. And then we can use the entity component to hold some functionality that will help us in selecting, because the entity component will know what group they're in and all other stuff like that. So when you do a single selection, for example, you can send it to the entity component and create a player selection based on the group and all that and send back the struct. So I think I might just create a component now. So under entities framework in the entities folder, I'm going to have a component folder in here. It's just going to be an actor component. And just call it entities component. Components folder. And again, I'm just going to do the initializer. We will not need this to tick, I think. In here, we'll want a function so we can get the entities component. So we're just going to make a static function. So I'm going to return the component. And we'll pass in the actor that we want to, so basically we're passing in the actor that we want to search for the component on here. We'll check the entity that we just passed in is not null. And just for the rest of this if statement here will be null point not found. So, and if what we passed in is null. And we need a colon here. All right, so now we can have some functionality here. And the first one I mentioned was the owning player. So let's just, even though we haven't set that yet, let's just, let's create that. So I'm gonna just do it virtual because we might want to subclass this at some point. I'm not sure, but make it virtual just so we can. I'm gonna make it a controller. So, no. Variable. Okay. autocorrect's trying to mess me up. Obviously that'll be set in at the point where we spawn the entity. Probably forget to set that, that'll be some fun debugging. But for now, we've got this reference that we need. We may actually want to replicate that. So that is replicated. And we'll go back to our, copy this. It's going to be do rep. And that's going to add the Unreal Network.h. For the owning player, we only need to replicate this to the owner themselves. So I'm going to put a condition on this one. And the condition of the owner only. So we want to make sure this component replicates. So we're going to set replicated by default to true. And that means on the entity, the actor component will be replicated. So in the case of it's a player trying to select some other player's unit, this will actually return as null. So as long as when we use this function, it'll just be null. So when we're trying to determine if you're the owner, your controller versus a null pointer is not going to match, and therefore not the owner. That's why we don't need to replicate the owning controller to all players. Never a good idea to do that. So the other thing we're going to want to do is create that player selection, like I said. So we're going to return so that's going to include our data types at the top. No, we'll just do a forward declaration. We're going to do a create player selection. So this will allow us to have a single entity but create a group selection or some other type of selection. So if we're doing like partial groups or individuals, this will still work. So what we're going to need access to here is a group variable we haven't got. So let's do that. This will be replicated as well. So I'm just going to duplicate this. So that's going to include the group.h. No, it's not. I'll do it again. We will be including them at some point. I'll just call this group. And now manage that. But anyway, that's the group. So when we come in to create player selection, we want to check that we have a group. Now we're going to return the player selection here. So this is where the constructor is going to come in handy, because what we want to do is pass in whatever we need for the group. So we're going to need, the group is the first thing. But then we're going to want a group lead. So this is where we can use the data on the entity to do this automatically off wherever we're trying to do it. Saves us implementing the functions multiple times in different places. Did we already do a constructor? Oh, we did, but it's just null. I'll come back to that in a sec. We'll create this function first. I'm going to return an actor. And that's erroring because it doesn't have a proper constructor. Do that first now. And duplicate this one. And we're going to pass in the group. What we need there. That sorts that out. And then a null pointer here. Now we basically want to iterate over the members of the group and determine who's the group leader. There's a number of ways we could do this. We could do it randomly. We can do it by rank. It depends what data you're going to have on your entities. I think I'll just do it by index, so their creation index. That'll do. Our group is not null. We want to start finding the index. It'll be the lowest index, so whoever was first created. But then, like, if we want a leader of a group but we don't have ranks or anything, we can just make sure that they're index 0. And we're going to need a list of members. And I think we'll just implement that on the group. So we'll create a function on there, just get members. We'll pass in this array, make it const. Go to the group. And we'll just create a void get members. That's going to pass in that array. And an array of members as a reference. And on here we are going to need to know who's our members. So it's going to need to be replicated, and it's going to be that same array. That's going to crack it, so we'll just call this earn members, and we'll just implement this const earn members. That should be fine. We'll do the replicating, otherwise we'll get that. So let's copy that from here again. I'm going to include the Unreal network.h again. This class. In the constructor connector, we need to use b replicates. Kicks on. Yeah, I won't get too much into that because there's a lot to add into that. Let's go back to our component now. Oh, it's not included, so we need to include our, and this is where we include it, the group. And that's our, oh, we need to return, oh yeah, we just need to return. This is why we need that is valid check. So, because I'm just going to return an empty player selection here, so return. So we need to be able to check that it's valid. When we use this, we need to do a valid check on whatever's returned. I'm going to close the, no, sorry, the group is what we close. I just want to show you how to use that component without going too much further into handling selection. One of the checks we're going to have to do here is, I might put in a separate function. I'm going to say handle single selection just to keep this main function neat, because there'll be a few functions in here. So in here we need to check that the client hit selectable actually hit something. So I'll put in a comment here. So if we actually did hit something, we need to get that entity interface. And the way we do that is we just call that static function. So that's going to add the entities component .h. And I'm just going to call the variable entity, because it's going to be where we read all our data off an entity. And then to use that static function, we just call the class find entity component, and we pass the actor that we're, or the entity that we're trying to get the component of, which in this case is the client selectable. So now we have access to all the entity data, so we can check right away is we didn't do is owning, as we did get owner. Let's do that. Yeah. That should turn if we're the owner. And we're on the player control, so we can just, we're going to have to do some input modifier stuff here, but for now, just this will be the default case anyway. We need to create a player selection. But what I want to do is I want to create a player selection because we're still client side here. So this handle selection is coming from this select end, which is on the client. That's the mouse input from the client. So we're actually going to create another variable, and it's going to be called, sorry, it's going to be an array of those player selections. But think of this as like the pre-list before it's the list. So in here, we want to add this, get the selection first. oh, it's a data types doesn't have because it's the first time I've used the player selection struct. So that'll create our, well, it'll either be null or empty selection, or it'll create a selection. And at the moment, it's going to assign a group leader based on the entire group. If we're trying to select a single unit, when we create this selection, the group leader is going to be based off every member of the group. So we need to inject some way of telling this that it's an individual selection. So we're going to go to our data types and add a enum. There we go. It's going to be an E selection type. And the first one's going to be group. I'll call it group selection so it doesn't use up the group word. So the other one will be single. And then we can add some partial ones and things later. So this enum. And what we're going to do is in our create player selection, we want to tell it what group type we're going to use. We're going to pass, in this case, single. So we don't have to pass that all the time. We'll set up a default. So come into here, change the const, and we'll say selection type. Okay, so that's added the data types here. So we can get rid of the reference there, and we can also get rid of reference here. Would be doubling up otherwise. So now what we might do is extract this group lead function out of here into a variable. So we'll say throw that there, but what we're going to do is say if the selection type is equal to type group selection, then we're gonna do the same thing. We're gonna go get the group lead, but if it's not, we're gonna use the group lead as this entity. We need another reference. Actually, no, sorry, we can use get owner. I'm pretty sure it'll be this entity, so we can just do get owner, which will be the actor that this component is attached to. And then we can just insert our group lead like that. So back where we were using this, we can now check that this selection is valid. So, and that's because we put the isValid function in the struct. There's a reason why we made that an array. That'll worry about that later, but we can make that const speed. So back where we find this, we're going to need to, I might comment these. We need to, just like we were when I was talking about clear selection, we need to handle the client-side selection, whatever it is, you know, highlighting and whatever. So and then we need to pass the selection to the server. And I'm going to put that through. So in the server handling, we want to check that if we don't have authority, like we're out. And then we just want to add the selections, and then we want to rep it. Well done here. Okay, we'll cut this video here and then we'll continue on in part 3. Thanks for watching.